All right. Hello, everybody out in Zoom land. Thank you for your patience with us. We've got a live audience here, so they're going to continue to trickle in. It's pretty cool. We got this hybrid technology to work, so and we're back. Like we were saying, thank you for bearing with us with the technology. Cool. All right. So yeah, we're here to talk about Measure 109. The Oregon Oregon Psilocybin Services Act for licensing psilocybin manufacturers, service centers, and facilitators to offer psilocybin services. So after a brief presentation, there's going to be an open forum for Q&A. The main topic today within the Psilocybin Services Act is the standard of care and liability risks for psilocybin services, both for service centers, which are the places you go to have a psilocybin administration session, and for the facilitators who are there the entire time. We're going to discuss ways to minimize risk. What are the risks, and how will the law potentially address a lot of new questions about what is being responsible, what is being irresponsible with this new thing. I'm going to introduce everybody and then we'll get started. So my name is Clancy. I'm a business lawyer and an intellectual property lawyer, and I was part of the team that researched and drafted Measure 109. I'm going to be running the tech and sort of co-moderating this event today. We got our usual host, Dave Kopilak. He's homesick with COVID, but he will be chiming in periodically and participating in the discussion as well. Dave is an experienced business lawyer, and he was the primary drafter of Measure 109. Joining us today, we've got Britt Rollins to my right. He's a co-founder of the National Psychedelics Association. We've got Alissa Bazinet. She's a clinical research psychologist, a psychedelic therapist, and has been a member of the training subcommittee of the Measure 109 Psilocybin Advisory Board through the Oregon Health Authority. We've got Bruce Howell. He's a former head of Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt's healthcare industry group, and he's a current professor of health law at Willamette Law School, and he's a practicing healthcare lawyer. And we have my colleague, Kaci Hohmann, who's also a business lawyer, and she was also part of the Measure 109 research and drafting team. All right, sorry about that, folks. We've got kind of a less stable internet connection than we've been having, so let's keep going. Sorry about that, Kaci.
Okay, sorry everyone. So we are recording this event because we usually post the speaker presentation portion to Emerge's YouTube channel. We don't, however, intend to use any audio or video from the Q&A session, so your name, face, or voice will not end up online. And as always, we want this event to be conversational in nature. We hope that it's a safe space to discuss the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act. So we ask that you please remain open to all viewpoints expressed today and be respectful of others. We've allocated 2 hours for the event. We like to have an extensive and lively Q&A session on our topics. We have some people in the audience today, and we have a lot of people online. So to keep things streamlined and efficient, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about how the Q&A session will proceed. So for those of you who are on Zoom, when you have questions or comments, if you'll just put your question or comment in the chat box, or just state that you have a question or comment in the chat box. You can also raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And during the Q&A session, I'll just call on your name. I'll kind of put you in a question queue. I'll call on your name to speak up whenever it's your turn. And for those of you who are in the audience, let's just do the good old fashioned raise your hand thing. So what I'm going to do is give in-person attendees the first chance to ask questions during the beginning of the Q&A session. And then I'll move on to questions from our Zoom attendees. And then throughout the remainder of the Q&A session, I'll just vacillate back and forth between in-person attendees and Zoom attendees. So if I don't get to you immediately, please just know that I will circle around eventually. And whenever you're asking questions, please try to avoid asking fact-specific questions. We are not acting as your attorneys today. We're not giving you any legal advice. We're just providing information for general educational purposes only. And if we run out of time and we don't get to you, feel free to email us your questions and comments at M109@emergelawgroup.com. And I'm going to put that email address in the chat box so everyone has it handy. And finally, Emerge has our deep dive events on the last Thursday of every month during 2022. Our next event will be on Thursday, July 28th from 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific. And if you have any suggestions for particular topics that you'd like us to cover during this series, feel free to make those suggestions in the chat box or email us, or after the event for those in person, come up to us and let us know because we'd love your input. So I'm going to jump over to the presentation portion of our event. Let me just share my screen real quick. Sorry, just one moment. Why is it? All right, there we are. Okay, so like Sean said, we're going to talk about standards of care and liability for psilocybin services today. So to begin, we need to go back to first day of law school, Tort Law 101. What is negligence? Negligence is the failure to exercise an appropriate duty of care for the protection of others. So if your conduct falls below the appropriate duty of care, that creates liability for negligence. So if you breach your appropriate duty of care and the plaintiff can prove causation and damages, then you can be held liable for those damages. So that begs the question of what is an appropriate standard of care? And Bruce is actually going to jump in and talk a little bit more about negligence real quick.
Right, and negligence in a professional venue is a little different than in a car accident. There are many factors that come in, one of which is where are you? Quite frankly, are you in a huge city with lots of ability to get ancillary care, or are you in a rural area? But the rule that Oregon uses is that it's a duty to use the degree of care, skill, and diligence that is used by ordinarily careful physicians in the same or similar circumstances in the community of the physician or a similar community. And we talk an awful lot about that in my classes. What is the duty? It's like being on a battlefield. If you're a trauma surgeon, you may do negligence that will not come back on you because it's a different situation.
So like Bruce just touched on, there are special standards of care for certain people. So the ordinary standard of care for everyday people doing everyday activities is measured by what a reasonable person would do or would not do under the same or similar circumstances. But there are special standards of care, and these are heightened standards of care beyond what a reasonable person would do under the circumstances. So professionals, specific industries, premises operators, and some other categories of individuals or entities are liable for these higher standards of care. And did you have anything else to add on that?
Not at all.
Okay. All right, so that begs the question of how are these special standards of care developed? So standards of care are developed through statutes, administrative rules, administrative hearings. They can be developed through the courts and judicial decisions. And the factors that are determinative of what a special standard of care is generally or widely accepted standards, practices, or customs in the profession or industry. So we ask this question of what is everyone else in the profession or industry doing? Do you have anything to add, Bruce?
The other thing I would mention about physicians and licensed persons is they have a heightened fiduciary duty. It's like a lawyer. A lawyer has a fiduciary duty, which is the highest level of duty to the patient or the client. And that level is something I found that the Oregon Medical Board has addressed, but I'll just give you a little flavor of it. The relationship between a provider and a patient must be based on trust, must be considered invaluable. Open and honest communication between the provider and the patient, including disclosure of all information necessary for the patient to be an informed participant in their care. And I think this is especially interesting in light of what we're discussing today. Go ahead.
All right. So standards of care will need to be developed for psilocybin service providers. So we'll look to the OHA rules at the outset. And then for facilitators who hold other professional licenses and who are practicing those other professions while providing psilocybin services, those facilitators will be subject to the standards of care that already exist for that other profession, in addition to the standards of care that will exist for facilitators generally. So at the outset, the OHA's rules will help us develop generally accepted standards and practices. And we don't have a lot of the OHA rules available to us right now. Many of them still need to be drafted and released and finalized by the OHA. But what we do have right now are final psilocybin training program core requirement rules. And we can look to those to kind of understand the buckets and categories that we might be able to look for standards of care within. So we have historical, traditional, contemporary practices and applications, cultural equity, safety, ethics and responsibilities, pharmacology, neuroscience, clinical research, core facilitation skills, preparation and orientation, administration and integration, and group facilitation. And those categories might help inform what the standard of care will be for facilitators.
Another thing that Dave and I have talked about a lot is, let's say you have a licensed individual using a facilitator. Is that licensed individual practicing psychology or medicine, or is that just simply affiliating with a facilitator who is simply doing facilitating? And I don't think the line on that is clear at all. And we'll have to wait for further guidance.
So beyond the OHA's rules, there's a question of whether or not at the outset we'll have other generally accepted standards and practices. And if so, where are those going to come from? Well, they could come from similar industries. It could come from FDA clinical trials for psychedelics. It could come from other countries where psychedelics are legal. They might come from the underground psychedelic industry. And we might also look to ancient indigenous practices to set certain standards of care.
Right.
Anything to add?
No.
Okay.
There is a phase 1 trial going on right now, as I understand it.
Mhm.
And that's really the beginning of the legitimization of this entire program.
So now that we've established that we have standards of care, ordinary and special, and that if you breach those standards of care, you can be held liable for negligence, for instance, what can facilitators and service centers do to protect themselves from liability? And one thing that people can do is what's known as an anticipatory release. This is an agreement that purports to immunize the released party for liability for its own negligence. And it has to be entered into before the injury occurs. It's generally enforceable if it's freely and fairly made. It's clear and unequivocal in its terms. It's between parties who are in equal bargaining positions with one another. It doesn't violate public policy. And also releases have to be limited to ordinary negligence only. They're not enforceable for gross negligence, recklessness, or intentional conduct.
I would point out that one of the best programs for releases would be found in clinical trials because those trials have populations that may or may not be vulnerable. And there's an entire set of rules and regulations and that need to be looked at in those clinical trial situations.
Yeah, and so what else would need to be in these releases for psilocybin service providers? They need to be robust and comprehensive, like Bruce is saying. It needs to be part of the overall contract that's made with the client. There needs to be the informed consent that's required by OHA rules, but probably some extra informed consent. Needs to include a comprehensive list of risks that the client has. And if you're a facilitator that's also a licensed professional, some sort of disclosure or disclaimer concerning that other profession. And the legal wording of releases is extremely important, as is the presentation, timing, and the opportunity for the client to review the release.
I think the word here is informed. And you really can never be fully informed but many hospitals and in fact some states actually have lists that are approved by physicians of the known risks for, say, a surgical procedure.
So another liability protection available is insurance. And we're not sure yet what kind of insurance is going to be available to service centers and facilitators. In cannabis, we have general commercial liability insurance and products liability insurance. Presumably that type of insurance will be available in the psilocybin industry as well, hopefully. But one category of insurance does not have that is relevant for psilocybin is professional liability for facilitation services. And it's unclear now, if we're going to get all three of those types of insurances. But in an ideal world, we will.
And it would be ideal. The problem we have right now is that just about every insurance policy I've ever reviewed has an exception for acts that are criminal. And we are certainly, we understand it's not a question, but Oregon has made psilocybin legal, but the federal government has not done so yet. And so my experience with any insurance policy is all it does is give you the right to sue. Insurance companies will send you a reservation of rights letter, and maybe they'll defend you and maybe not, but they love to hold on to their money.
Yeah. And so for facilitators who hold other professional licenses and who are practicing those other professions while providing psilocybin facilitation services, there are a lot of big question marks about insurance. For instance, will the existing professional liability policies cover the activities that are provided while providing psilocybin services? Will basic professional psilocybin facilitator liability insurance, if it exists at all, cover the activities that involve the other licensed profession? And so for these facilitators who want to simultaneously utilize their professional licenses while providing facilitation services, the merging of those professions could make that particular facilitator uninsurable at all levels. And so we could see an insurance gap. And that is a risk that, we're just, time will tell what happens. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that during the course of this event. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to kick it over to Sean, who's going to kind of moderate the roundtable discussion that we have with our panelists.
Yeah, thanks, Kaci. Interesting stuff. So, I mean, my first question here is like, when we're talking about liability, like what are these risks that we're talking about? This is a question for Alissa, because you've studied this, you've been around it for a good portion of your career. Like, what are the worst case scenarios? What are the common scenarios? What can go wrong? How likely is it?
Yeah, really great questions. Most of what we know about the safety of psilocybin at this point in terms of data come from clinical trials where psilocybin has been used as a treatment for a particular indication. So the limitation to that data is that we have people who are participating in the research study who have a certain diagnosis. They often are screened in because they don't have sort of other potential risk factors. So it's sort of this chicken or the egg type question where, psilocybin is incredibly safe from the data that we do have. There have not been a lot of reports of long-term adverse events. However, we are screening out certain vulnerable populations where there might be more risk, and we don't actually know for sure what the risk is for those populations. For instance, in older research data, there is some indication that folks who have a family history of certain diagnoses such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia may have a higher likelihood of developing the first instance of symptoms related to those conditions themselves. So potentially a manic episode after taking psilocybin. So in the Compass Pathways study, there was a higher incidence of adverse event in the folks who had psilocybin, meaning there was an increased incidence of suicidal behavior. This was not necessarily statistically significant, small sample sizes, And most of the adverse events occurred a week or more following the administration of psilocybin. So there was some question of, how related to psilocybin were those adverse events? Or, is that not really, that it's not a correlation that we can really say for certain. What else? So in terms of medical safety, psilocybin is incredibly safe. I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a psychologist, so I don't have all the information about this, but I do know that there is a contraindication with lithium. So folks who are on lithium and taking psilocybin, there's an increased risk of seizure. It does prolong at higher doses, can prolong the QT interval, which is a measure of the electrical conduction of the heart. So that can be problematic for folks with certain cardiac conditions. So those are sort of the two main medical risks that I'm aware of. However, the sort of incidence of emergency room visits and things like that for folks who've ingested psilocybin, it's like one of the lowest substances to cause any sort of problem in that way, much lower than alcohol, much lower than, of course, opiates. So we do know that it is quite safe comparatively to other substances.
So so what are those are some sounds like bad things, kind of exceptional things that can happen. What's a kind of a more common, what's the most common thing that happens for typical people?
Yeah, so I can speak to that really just from my subjective experience of working with folks who've had a challenging experience with psilocybin or other psychedelics. So part of my private practice, I do what's called psychedelic integration work, which is folks that have had an experience in their everyday lives, whether that's recreationally or with an underground guide or in sort of a religious or ceremonial context, are having some difficulty making sense of what happened. So I would say that a more common, I don't know if I want to call it a adverse event, but a situation is that folks can recall something in the midst of their psilocybin experience that they maybe weren't prepared to remember, or can have these really major realizations about their lives that can come unexpectedly. So this could be something like, oh my gosh, I need to leave my spouse. I'm in an abusive relationship. My job is terrible. I need to leave it immediately. Some sort of realization, or everything that I thought that I believed about the world is wrong. So now what do I do with my life? And so that can be quite distressing. And the after effect of the psilocybin. So this is not necessarily happening, although it can happen in the midst of the experience, but people enter into that process, which continues days, weeks, months following that singular experience. And so there's a need for support for people to make sense of those things and figure out what to do so they're not making rash decisions or, feeling like they don't know how to manage their lives. So this can lead to potentially suicidality or other sorts of mental health struggles if they're not sure how to integrate that.
So thinking about that and support and being that sort of being a thing that perhaps that is going to be the role of what the facilitators have. This is a question for both Britt and Alissa. So then what is the role of the minimally qualified facilitator, the facilitator who's not a physician, who's not a psychologist? What and perhaps coming from what you both know about the industry, what would that support look like? What are the needs that need to be met, just at a very basic, bare bones level for somebody without those extra qualifications?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you jump in on that one.
So really the role of the facilitator in the psilocybin administration session itself. So I have other things to say about screening, assessment, integration, what happens before and after, but during is really just to support that person to safely experience whatever they're experiencing. So that is whatever emotions they're feeling, however they want to express that, as long as it is safe to themselves and anyone else in the room to just hold that experience and not try to guide it, not try to change it, not try to interrupt it in any way, unless there's some sort of emergency situation for the person's safety. So the facilitator's qualification is really to learn how to understand themselves and how to not be an influence on that person's experience. So it actually does take some learning and practice, but there's not necessarily an existing licensed profession that fully teaches that alone. I mean, definitely we learn some of that in how to be a psychotherapist, but anyone, I think, can learn how to do that with proper training and experience.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, Britt, like with the National Psychedelic Association, what sorts of walks of life and sort of backgrounds then are you encountering when meeting with people? What sorts of experiences are people bringing that might be aligned or aiming at that? And what's motivating people to get into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons people are motivated to get into this work. I think of the role of facilitator as really a supportive role, right? Some before, definitely during, and some afterwards. But they are one part of a continuum of care. And so if you look at any type of care team, just think of this as another person who's a part of that team who can support you in the medicine when you're maybe experiencing things of that nature. I think all walks of life are coming to this. I think there's a lot of questions over who's going to be allowed to participate. And so I think that, I've met folks underground, above ground, clinicians and otherwise who have interest here. I think it's just still a question of who will be able to participate and to what end.
How about other licensed professionals? Like, why might a licensed professional want to get into this? Given that this is uncertain, there's risks.
Yeah, let the licensed professional speak to it.
I can speak from my own experience. So I have, I am an above ground licensed psychologist. So I have avoided putting my license at risk by engaging in this practice underground. However, I have for a long time been a volunteer for peer support organizations that work at music festivals and events to sit with folks who are having psychedelic experiences. And it's been some of the most powerful, incredible work of my life to see folks transform this experience into something that's really meaningful, to keep them sort of out of being sedated and medical or being, taken out of the event by security, to just be with them. And really that's all it is to just sit there with them and allow them to experience what they're experiencing without judgment. And it has turned me on to this career of being a psychedelic therapist, honestly. So those first experiences and seeing the kinds of realizations and awarenesses that people come to organically, I spend years helping people come to those realizations in sort of regular talk therapy. So it really does feel like it can catalyze that process.
So do you think it's dangerous to start mixing the professions though, because there's a professional license involved, and maybe this is a question that Bruce might think about too, overlapping licenses, and is it possible to disclaim a license? So say I'm not acting as a psychologist right now, I'm only acting as a facilitator, or not acting as a physician, or not acting as any other licensed professional. Is it possible to do one and not the other legally?
Legally, I don't think so. I think the better example is, suppose you have a physician who owns a facility, really hands off, just owns it. I think the physician could be criticized by the board for just owning something that is unfortunately still illegal in most states. But I don't. That's a very, very slippery question, and the way to think about it is this: if I'm a physician and I'm driving a car, I'm licensed by two entities. I've got my physician's license and I've got my driver's license, and those are really separate. But if I'm a physician and I also have a licensed facilitator, well, am I engaged in the practice of medicine when that facilitator is facilitating? That's a closer question. And the practice of medicine is a very, very broad practice. This is one of the things we have to think about, because I know there are a lot of people lay persons who are looking to invest in these facilities. And it's all well and good if it's not the practice of medicine. But if it is, then you have something called the corporate practice of medicine prohibition you have to think about. And so these are very interesting questions, as we like to say in law school, and we have to think about them.
Yeah, I see Dave has his hand up and wanted to chime in.
Yeah, hi. Can you guys in the room hear me there? All right.
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. So picking up on Bruce's response, Measure 109 states that it's essentially a non-medical act in the first place. A facilitator, the OHA is prohibited from requiring a facilitator to have any sort of degree of higher education, meaning they can't be, they can't require facilitators to be doctors or psychologists or any other licensed profession. So it doesn't mean a facilitator cannot be a doctor, but the OHA can't promulgate rules that would require somebody to practice medicine or practice psychology. So if there's no way to avoid that, then the whole act is going to collapse on itself. So that can't be the case, I think. So now, when I looked at the definition of practice of medicine or practice of psychology in the statute, what is the defining, what is practicing psychology, what is practicing medicine? The magic words seem to be diagnose, cure, and treat. Diagnose, cure, and treat. And Alissa, you mentioned about the screening, right? So that's really interesting, because it seems to me that if somebody's going to be doing any screening, you're creeping up on diagnosing somebody, and the person doing that would have to be a licensed something or other. But I also think that if the facilitator does not have a higher degree of education, or is not a doctor or psychologist or anything else, I'm not sure they even could do any screening beyond that promulgated by the OHA itself. I mean, the OHA can have a client information form, an informed consent document that is just basically follow the dotted line, and it's basically kind of an if-then chart. If the client checks these boxes, you're out. If they check these boxes, you're in. And I think those rules have to be that way, because a facilitator, you can't require a facilitator to diagnose. So, so I think we have to come to the conclusion that there is a way to be a facilitator without practicing medicine, without practicing psychology, without practicing anything else that requires a degree of, from a higher education. So, so raising, recognizing that, Alissa, I not to put you on the spot, I know you're a licensed psychologist. Thinking about the insurance issue, thinking about liability, like, would you sort of take your psychologist hat off and say, hey, yes, here's my resume. I'm Alissa, I'm a licensed psychologist, and here's why I'm really great at everything. But during this session, or during my provision of psilocybin services, I'm not doing that. I'm not acting as a psychologist. I'm not doing this. All I'm doing is being a facilitator. And that means I will be only doing X, Y, and Z, and I won't be doing blah, blah, blah. Or do you think it's you don't want to do that from a marketing, from a business perspective, like if you can figure out a way around insurance and figure out, or you're comfortable with the liability, you do want to do that. Or to make things even more complicated, would you want to do it maybe on the front end? Hey, I'm acting as a psychologist during the preparation session, and maybe during the integration session, which would seem to be a little bit low risk, but not during the administration session. So sorry for the long question, but that's the big setup right here. I think that's the big issue.
Yeah, well, you're not naming anything that I'm not thinking about every day. So I'm totally happy to tell you my thoughts. I don't know that I am ethically comfortable stating in an administration session that I am a licensed psychologist, but I will not be acting in that capacity during my psilocybin facilitation. I'm not sure it's possible to fully separate my identity and my sort of way of being and my ethical mandates as a licensed psychologist. And I'm not identifying any places where the act of psilocybin facilitation is somehow in direct contradiction to the ethical code that I'm bound to. It's more, it's just such a gray area, and I feel like I'm going to need more information from OHA and, you know, the rules and regulations as they're released before I feel comfortable facilitating. That being said, I think that my real role and where I feel really ethically committed to helping with this rollout is in sort of the screening, assessment, treatment planning, risk and benefit assessments for clients who do have more complex needs. Because my biggest fear about this program the entire time I've been involved in implementing and watching it roll out is that the most vulnerable folks who maybe really would benefit from this, and I get emails every single day from folks that are like, when our psilocybin service is going to be legal? I have treatment-resistant depression, I have PTSD, I'm suicidal, I've tried everything, I need this, right? And I don't know that we have evidence that this is the thing for them. And I think part of the problem is like media bias and hype, right? That folks are coming in with these expectations. But again, my fear is that these folks who really could benefit from these services will have to be screened out. That we will have this checklist that OHA will release, like any indication that there's any risk whatsoever, we're going to have to screen them out, because I think true risk benefit assessment is very, very nuanced and does require a lot of training and does encroach upon this practice of psychology or medicine if we're asking complicated medical questions. So I think, you know, in my ideal world, I could help on that end, on the assessment end. I can't, and this I know from already speaking with my licensing board, I can't recommend that anyone do psilocybin. This is already the case when folks come to me for what I'm calling harm reduction, where they say, I want to take psilocybin in my everyday life. How, you know, can you send me to an underground practitioner? I can't do that, but I can say, well, if you find an underground practitioner, I can support you in making sure that your experience is safe and effective for your specific goals and needs. So this is the place where I feel like I can help, or where I'm most effective. The facilitation itself, I'm not sure what role I'll be able to have.
So if the OHA has a flow chart, if you will, if the client information form is some sort of flow chart, which will maybe have, you know, a green light or a red light, you're saying that may be well and good, but some businesses or some service centers or facilitators may want to dig deeper and ask more questions and to maybe perhaps disqualify more people. I mean, is there a risk of asking too many questions and subjecting yourself, like holding yourself to a higher standard? It's one thing to say, hey, I'm not a doctor, I followed the client information form, I followed the rules. If you're a green light, all this bad stuff can happen to you. Here's your release, and I don't want to dig any deeper. Like, that's the safest thing for me to do for my own liability. Or do you open up a can of, you know, liability worms, if you will, by, okay, well, let me ask you 25 more questions and, you know, eventually say, okay, I think you're okay. And then what if you're wrong and they have an experience? Like, are you potentially subjecting yourself to more liability by putting them through a more robust test, which with all good intentions, I mean, that's what you're trying to do. But now you're wrong. And then you can't just say, hey, the defense of saying, hey, just follow the OHA's rules might not be available to you because you voluntarily undertook to screen them at a higher level.
Yeah, this is where I get mixed up between ethical commitments that I've made to the people I work with versus my own liability. And I err on the side of really asking the level of question, I guess, as you're putting it, or, you know, making the assessment as comprehensive as needed to be able to give them accurate information, which is part of informed consent, especially if someone is coming in saying, I have XYZ symptom or XYZ diagnosis, even though this program is not asking about diagnosis, is not purporting to treat any diagnosis. That client has an expectation of a treatment for their diagnosis, even though we're telling them that this is not what this is, because we have all of this evidence in the clinical trial that that's possible. So I feel like it's my ethical duty to make sure I understand my client and give them the best information so that they can make their own informed decision about whether they're willing to take the risk or not.
It seems like there's going to be, there's a difference between like best practices though, and like the minimum standard of like, I've sufficiently met the minimum amount to reach informed consent to be a responsible facilitator. You were about to say something, Britt.
Yeah, no, I wanted to chime in on this because I think it sounds like we're talking about denial of service. And I don't think that that's what assessment necessarily means. It's about the on-ramps and off-ramps to get them to the right type of care and the right type of provider. So it's that way through assessment, we better understand the level of care you might need in these situations, albeit there's still the ability for things to fall outside of that scope. I just think we shouldn't talk about it in ways that result in this idea of denial of care, right? Where it's like, oh, if you get assessed and you don't get these 3 boxes, you're not going to get these services. I think through things like, kind of client roadmaps and ways, it's like, well, maybe you do need to do a little bit of therapy first. Maybe this is a way to get people back into the medical system and get therapy for them, and then come back and have psilocybin services, as opposed to, oh, Wyatt, we're not sure here. This box is checked. Sorry, you're not playing. I don't think that that's the case.
Yeah, it's really about what other services does this person need? Like, what does this individual need for this experience to be safe and effective for them?
I know you've been talking to, this is a slight turn, but I know, Britt, you've been talking to insurers a bit, and I'm curious, like, what they're thinking about all this.
They're not, to be honest, but when addressed and brought up to them, let's be clear, right now, we're only looking at facilitator training programs, because that's the ones that are furthest along. And when we think about insurance, different parts of the supply chain, as it were, will require different products. But for training programs, 24 denials from current providers. So, there's not a lot of hand raisers as far as those who will take it now. Simultaneously, this is not uncommon for a new industry or a new sector. And if we look at cannabis, there are, ways in which insurance products can be brought to the market without relying on some of the standard providers, your Allstates or even your Lloyds of London, right? Like, these are the type of places, there's other avenues for reaching insurance that aren't necessarily your typical, strip mall.
Have they given any specific feedback about why now? Or
I think it's just a denial of application outright for first go, but I think it's because there's just a lack of information. Think about insurance. It's about being able to understand risk and appropriately determine risk, and then be able to, underwrite against that. And so really, there's not enough information available, I think, and that's where hopefully some of the conversation goes today, right? Is to be able to understand what are those ancillary areas that are similar, that are analogous to what we're trying to pull forward here, and making sure that at least those type of examples can provide some level of understanding and risk assessment.
so is there a way in which, like, maybe having a lower standard, facilitator is not a physician, is not a psychologist, having a lower standard would increase access, increase data? It seems like that's a good thing. Like having a lower, okay, a facilitator, is it enough for a facilitator to offer, a cookie and a pat on the back and be ready to call 911? Is that in order to get more data, in order to open up access, in order to make this something that's accessible?
You want to go with that one first, or?
It sounds like you do.
No,
I'm
no.
gonna let you. I don't know.
So I think that the individuals that I know that are going, and through my own personal experience through the underground with someone who was both licensed and working underground, a lot of these folks tend to be people who are really looking to care and provide care. And let's acknowledge the fact that Measure 109 stands outside of the medical system. And it is not that we are providing medical therapy through psilocybin. We are providing supervised adult use for psilocybin products and the related. And so as such, when we talk about those and then pat on the back, right? Let's think about this as just those are individuals who are coming in the system who do not need extra care. And so there are a certain set of individuals who will be most ready to provide those. At the same time, I wouldn't argue from my own experience that I'm sorry, Alyssa, that, a trained clinician, or even psychiatrist, psychologist is always ready to be the type of person to facilitate these experiences, to hold those spaces. From my own personal experience as a gay man, I really needed a provider, an underground provider who had lived that same experience as me. The first person that was kind of suggested was a woman, and I had no problem with the idea of that, but that lived resonance, that same experience was very important. I know it's very important to a lot of people. And so there are going to be some trade-offs sometimes that you're going to have to look at what is the trauma they've experienced and how do they deal with that, and who's going to be the best person to take care of them when they are having these very profound and deep experiences.
Because there's each person, then there might be a different best practice for each individual. I think that the question that, where we keep coming back to is like probably the insurers too, is what will the minimum be then? So it's important for these people with exceptional, circumstances to have the care they need, because this is puts them in a very vulnerable state. But yeah, striking that balance is going to be very tricky, especially with all of the interested licensed professionals who do want to, and I think the people that are also coming maybe from outside the medical system and don't have the qualifications, but essentially want to be caring for people in medical ways. And this is opening up, them to entering in some of those practices and doing some things that might bleed into practicing medicine or practicing psychology. Is that necessarily bad?
What was the question? If unlicensed facilitators are practicing medicine or psychology?
Yeah.
I think so, but maybe I'll let the healthcare law person answer that.
Let's, if I came to you, Alyssa, and you thought that I might need Zoloft, let's say.
Well, I can't tell you that because I'm not
but
a medical doctor.
Right,
but, yes.
But you might refer me to a psychiatrist who could prescribe that, correct?
Sure, yeah, if that's something that you were looking for, yes.
Right, and we might talk about it. So the psychiatrist could clearly prescribe that for me. And that would be perfectly legal, even though it is a controlled substance, because it's not on Schedule I. Now, the thing that puts a controlled substance under Schedule I and marijuana's on there, and psilocybin and the like, and isn't really, I realize that this legislation will allow people just to use psilocybin if they feel like it. But isn't one of the way of legitimizing this in the long term of showing real good medical results?
Yes, depending on the indication that you're seeking the psilocybin for, if it is for improvement of a medical condition or psychological condition, yes, we need to see data that this actually is effective for those indications. And
I know that there's a petition right now to take it off of Schedule I. I think as a lawyer, I'm looking for the solution here. It's not as if I think Oregon may have stepped ahead a little bit, but it's not as if everyone out there is going to accept this going on, and that's of course concerns me. But if indeed it has medical value, then I think the full court press should be put on the FDA.
So the act is not medical though, and this is a facilitator is a new thing, a service center is a new thing. I've been asking people, what is like the most analogous thing to a facilitator? Is it more like a ski instructor? Is it like a chiropractor? Is it a life coach? Is it some combination of those things?
I equate it to a doula. If I think about somebody who sits outside of the medical profession but has a role in and supports a medical situation, specifically someone as a dad, something so profound as childbirth, like that is also so profound as some of the ineffable experiences you will have on these higher macro doses, under these services. So I think a doula not being medically licensed, I mean, that's what I've always thought of as, that support role in a very important experience.
Well, I discovered something in my preparations for today, that the pharmacy rules actually have a controlled substances list. And psilocybin is on that, excuse me, with the exception, it's been put in the law now, of if you are if you're in accordance with the psilocybin statute, then it's not a controlled substance for pharmacists. Now, the lines are getting really blurry here. And that's, when you say, Sean, that this is not a medical act, and I'm looking at it, I'm going, I got to think about that a little bit.
I mean, it's almost irrelevant, I think, to a certain point, that the Board of Pharmacy has decided that psilocybin is not a controlled substance for pharmaceutical purposes because it's administered at a service center, not at a pharmacy. A pharmacist cannot administer psilocybin unless they are working at a service center administering the psilocybin. So I don't know how much protection that actually offers pharmacists in real life, but that's just,
Well, I think though it's also the distribution, and that's in the statute. So it's not just, the pharmacist decides it's going to sell it to a facility. That could be an issue, and that's exempted. That's okay. So, I mean, whether it's a dog or a cat, we can debate this all the time.
One question I have, and I think I probably about time to jump to Q&A if we're ready, but talking about this gap of insurance that we don't have currently, we have to find ways to protect service centers and facilitators anyways. And we talked a little bit about that in the presentation through liability waivers and releases. So I'm curious, and maybe Bruce, you might know the answer to this or be the best positioned person to answer, but could a very robust informed consent, liability waiver, assumption of risk contract that seeks to protect someone from negligence claims, how enforceable are those in the medical field? How do those uphold for medical doctors and psychologists, just based on the current state of the law?
Well, yeah, based upon the current state of the law, you can use waivers. They are not bulletproof, I can tell you that. It's informed consent, for example, is in ORS 677. And it requires general terms of the treatment, alternative procedures or treatments, risks. You've got to have risks in there. So if you're using an informed consent, you really have to make it robust.
Must be really comprehensive about it. Sean, did you have any other? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question about this because I was interested in this and looking into it. And I know the question was, in the medical world, how does informed consent or waivers work? But if we looked at this from a different angle, and I'd love your opinion from, let's say, adult recreation activities like snow skiing, right? Some see it as safe, some see it as dangerous. Either way, it is an adult activity in which you're participating in. That
Can be very profound, I'll say.
Yeah, if you're a great skier, maybe.
Yeah.
But my question is does that change the level of the ability of enforcement if we look at it from non-medical and look at it from something more like adult recreation?
Well, I mean, in preparing for this, Dave's nodding his head. Dave, do you want to chime in here? I mean, we looked into our legal intern, Jenna, who's on the call, actually looked into a lot of release law in Oregon and waiver law, and a lot of it had to do with Mount Hood Meadows and this exact scenario. So, Dave, did you want to chime in?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where I think, somebody in Alyssa's position, I think, by the time they get licensed as a facilitator and they're seeing their very first, psilocybin client, they're going to have to make a decision about what side of the fence are you on, or are you on two sides of the fence? Are you only a facilitator who happens to be a psychologist who's not practicing psychology, at this moment, or are you openly embracing both at the same time? You know, not, and Alissa, you eloquently described how you look out for the clients and everything. I'll be just a lawyer and say, like, if all you want to do is protect yourself, like the simplest thing for me is to say, look, I'm a bare bones facilitator. I'm going to follow the OHA's rules. The OHA are smart people. They're a health administrative agency, for God's sakes. And they've given me this information, informed consent, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow their thing here. Then I'm going to have you, the client, sign a very robust liability waiver. And Kaci, there's a lot of case law in this stuff. And Britt, Kaci was referring to, there's a bunch of cases from, ski resorts, right? Who, put the liability waiver on the back of your ski pass in 8-point font that nobody reads. And then they lose those cases. They often lose those cases because there wasn't any real informed consent. So if it was me, advising somebody, I'd have big, bold, conspicuous things that the client's initial, that here's a whole bunch of stuff that could go wrong. You're assuming the risk, and I would analogize it, or you could analogize it to some, relatively dangerous, not that psilocybin is inherently dangerous, but to cover yourself. I'm climbing Mount Everest. I'm gonna be your Sherpa climbing Mount Everest, and you're going on this journey, and a whole bunch of bad stuff can happen, and you're okay with that. Here's everything that can happen. I'm gonna do my job the best I can, but anything can happen during the session, Alissa, a week after the session, a month after the session, a year. Like, you're assuming that risk, and there you go. And so, to the greatest extent by law, Bruce is right. Nothing's 100% bulletproof, and you can't contract away your own gross negligence or really reckless behavior. But if you were intent on sort of, hey, there's no insurance available. Hey, the greater good for me is to actually stay in business and not get sued all the time. That's what I would do.
Can I ask a question of you all when it relates to that? Because if you think about liability and things like, I think a lot of times it refers to like bodily injury, but does it deal with like mental injury? Like, because we're talking about trauma, we're talking about mental anguish, we're talking about re-traumatization. Are those things covered under typical liability, and is that outside of?
Kaci and I were just talking about this morning, is because, one of the elements of the tort of negligence is damage. And so it's like, what is the damage? What is the harm? And how do you quantify that if you're talking about a lawsuit? Like, how can we pin down who's been damaged? That's kind of why I wanted to get to the first question from Alissa, like what kind of damage can really occur, and can it be how can it be quantified?
Do you want me to answer that again, or?
Well, I guess it looks like Bruce is thinking about it.
Well, I'm thinking about all this stuff.
I mean,
damages are very, it's the hardest part of any medical mal case. And there are many factors that go into it. Med mal lawyers will bring in economists and so forth. One of the things that we have here is mental anguish as a separate cause, actually, a cause of action. And so these things can be compensated but you've got to make the connection between taking psilocybin and this result that caused damage. So if you don't have that connection, then you might survive a jury trial. And that's one of the things I think, one of the questions I would have is, how am I going to screen people? I was asking Alissa if there have been any genetic studies on this, because in all truthfulness, this is all one big chemical equation. And I don't think you knew of any, but genetics would come into into the equation, quite frankly, as to, and there are just so many things. And I just think the takeaway is, moving forward, there may be some risks.
I think there's this term in law school, we talk about the eggshell plaintiff, who's got the eggshell skull. And if it turns out this person has a skull that's made of eggs, too bad if they hurt themselves when you gently bump them.
Yep.
I think we're talking about concerns about those types of potential patients, but better clients, and balancing those against like the kind of broader vision of this measure and what it could be.
On perception, right? Because we have this propaganda campaign of your brain on drugs. And so how will that stand up in a jury if they think that really there is something undue under there? I mean, there's that broader issue that we've been teaching people something very uninformed for a very long time. And so, like, I mean, you can say this is the rule and this is how these follow, but we've done a very good job of misinforming folks on the truth.
Here's another, I think this is a more pleasant question for Alissa. What's a good experience? Like, what is the value here? Like, what are people stand to gain?
Yeah, thank you. I like this question.
Positive stuff.
Yeah, I mean, people can have really amazing revelations about, what's not working in their lives or what they need to do in order to improve some of the situations in their lives that have not been serving them. People can have really incredible transformations just from one or even two psilocybin experiences. People have named it as being in like the top 5 most impactful experiences of their lives, like up there with the birth of a child or getting married. So these are not insignificant experiences, and they really can have the potential to change the course of someone's life.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead. I was going to jump to Q&A next. So you finish
Okay.
your thought.
There's a fascinating book that was recommended to me called The Immortality Key.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that struck me is that psilocybin's been around forever. This book goes back actually into Greek history and talks about it and so forth. And it's only 1968 when it got put on the controlled substance list. So I think to some extent that's a little artificial to say it's now a controlled substance, because it was a different country then. I lived through it, believe me, and I still remember the 60s.
One of the few.
One of the few who do.